now I got to step off my soapbox. Yeah. When did we go live? What have we covered?
I think it's past 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Not much, but
Yeah. Dr. Schubert, welcome back.
Well, thank
It's
you.
really good to have you, man.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah. What's the topic of preaching these days?
Well, last year we finished Exodus, and so this year we're picking up Hebrews. So we're continuing to go back and forth between Old Testament and New Testament, but seemed to be a logical connection between the Levitical priesthood, the law, all that elements in Exodus, and then go on to Hebrews, where he's writing to a Jewish audience that knows all of those things very well and pointing them to Christ through Hebrews. So yeah, that's where we're at now.
Okay. And he being St. Paul.
Well, probably not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, there is still a camp that argues for St. Paul as the author of Hebrews. There are absolutely Pauline elements to Hebrews. Yeah, phrases, various ways in which Paul talks about the law, talks about Jesus that are picked up in Hebrews, which is one of the reasons why most scholars argue it is Pauline, but probably not Paul.
Okay.
So someone in
Timothy?
Paul's circle. Yeah.
Barnabas?
Timothy is very popular. Barnabas is very popular because both of them are also Jews. And it seems to be a Jewish Christian in Paul's circle. But it also seems to be someone who's not first generation. Because he mentions, I think this is in chapter 2 or 3, he mentions, the message that came from the Lord Jesus that we heard from the apostles. So that suggests that it's not Matthew, Mark, Luke. It's not, or well, Luke would actually work, but it's not Paul who heard directly from Jesus, the Damascus Road. It's not Matthew. It's not Peter. It's not someone like that who heard the message from Jesus. It's someone who heard the message of Jesus through the apostles. So then someone like Timothy would work really well. Barnabas sometimes comes up. Apollos is a very popular choice because he's well known for his rhetoric and his skill in the Book of Acts. He's known as a brilliant speaker. He's Jewish. He's taught by Priscilla and Aquila, who are compatriots and co-workers with Paul. So that would make the connection to Paul and his work. So yeah, we don't know. Fundamentally, I think Origin, is it Origin or somebody else who says, God only knows who wrote the book of Hebrews, but yeah, so most people say probably not Paul.
Does it matter?
I don't think it matters. I I do think it matters that it has Pauline authority behind it. I think that is important in the same way that, Mark and Luke aren't written by apostles, but they're written in the shadow of apostles, so to speak. Mark as the disciple of Peter, Luke as a disciple of Paul, that they have apostolic authority. That's pretty early in the church is established as necessary. I can't remember which one it is. Irenaeus, I think. Yeah, I think it's Irenaeus who's talking about the different texts that are rejected from being part of the canon of Scripture, and he talks about how the Shepherd of Hermas clearly is not part of the canon of Scripture because it was written in our day rather than in the apostles' day. So there, I think there is an importance to having apostolic authority, but not necessarily written by an apostle.
Okay. It seems to me that sometimes we prefer to bat back and forth over the tennis net of debate, the authorship of anything from biblical text to Shakespeare.
Sure.
Yeah. In the more modern day, maybe the origins of certain conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
But often it seems to be a bit of a replacement for actually grappling with the ideas themselves.
No, that's fair. Yeah, and the church very widely accepted Hebrews from a very early date. So as much as there was a conversation about the authorship from fairly early on, there was also a pretty broad acceptance of Hebrews from pretty early on. So yeah, I don't have much trouble accepting it as scripture from that side. I wouldn't want to plant my flag on it was Paul. Maybe.
So you mentioned Apollos and then Aquila.
Yeah,
So
Priscilla and Aquila.
okay, so these are Jewish religious who are ethnically Greek or Roman.
No, Priscilla, Aquila, and Apollos are all Jews. They have Greek names because of their associations, placement where they were born in various Greek colonies.
Oh,
The diaspora of the
they
Jewish
would have been part of
people
the
around,
diaspora.
yeah, around the
Okay.
Mediterranean world, but they're Jews. Who come out of Judaism, become Christians, as most of the early church was Jewish Christians, and they're spoken of repeatedly in Acts, and then Apollos comes up both in Acts and also in First Corinthians. Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned in the greetings and salutations by Paul in several epistles. So
I think it's always been easy for me to imagine that if you were a Jewish person in the first century, you've been raised in this tradition of awaiting the Messiah. And that's always made a lot of sense that other Jews make an argument to me that Jesus Christ fulfills these very known signs of what we should be looking for, right? But I've always struggled to imagine what people from outside that tradition would have actually been able to latch onto in the story of Jesus Christ, right? Like it seems to me that they would not have had the same expectation of a Messiah that would be
sure.
necessary to bring to an encounter with the story of this man Yeshua who lived in Palestine at this very specific time. Do we have a sense of how these Gentiles were becoming Christians?
Yeah, sort of two groups. The initial movement was very much among what they called God-fearing Jew or Gentiles, God-fearing Gentiles. So there were meaningful number of Gentiles who had been attracted to Judaism, to the Old Testament, to this practice that saw none of the chaos and the just ugliness of the Greek and Roman gods and the pantheism and the gods getting drunk and sleeping around, and what is this that we're worshiping here?
Uh-huh.
So there's that initial group of Gentiles who had already been attracted to Judaism, and so that's probably the initial inroad. But then you do see people like Justin Martyr and some of the other apologists in the early church arguing about that this is why Christians aren't atheists, and this is why Christians aren't actually cannibals, and this is why Christians aren't actually marrying brother and sister, because they're addressing all of these radical misunderstandings of Christianity that are coming from the Gentile world. And yeah, that starts to become more and more important as the Jewish community either accepts or rejects, and kind of it gets a little more locked in one way or the other, and the Gentile community becomes more and more the target audience.
Sorry, the Gentile community becomes the target audience.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, because the Jewish community begins as the audience. Paul talks about that, how he went from synagogue to synagogue in his journeys. That's where he starts. He goes to the synagogue and starts preaching there. And after he's accepted or rejected and does all he can there, that's when he starts going to the Areopagus and Athens and Mars Hill and various other places where he's like, okay, I've done everything I can with the most obvious place to start, the Jews who should get this. So now let me start talking to the Gentiles, who this is going to be a little bit of a heavier lift, but let me start explaining to them how I know about this God that you kind of worship, in this God of the unknown, and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, the focus of the church shifts in the first couple hundred years away from Jewish conversion to Gentile conversion.
I saw a map of bishoprics, and it looked like in the third century there was basically an explosion of new bishops' sees. So basically recognized branches of the church.
Mhm.
Do you know if was there something that happened in that third century that was very specific that this Gentile audience caught fire in some way?
Yeah, I guess I couldn't nail down exactly what would be in the third century, what that moment would be. I'd have to look at the history books.
Okay.
I know the spread was very much among women and slaves to begin with.
Hmm.
That was a very common approach because it honestly gave meaning and understanding to people who were in very very oppressed, very marginalized situations in the Roman world. And here is someone who comes along and says, "No, you too are made in the image of God. You too have a meaningful life. You too can have meaningful life even if you never get out of slavery." There was very much the accusation that that Christianity was the religion of women and slaves in the ancient world. And obviously that starts transitioning before this, but Constantine and all of that, 313, and then later 370 or 372 when it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, but that's much later than what you're talking about.
Wow. Right. That would have been so remarkable to take someone from a time machine and
Oh yeah.
fast forward them 200 years. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. How did this happen? The religion of the women and slaves is now the religion of the empire?
Yep.
Holy cow, what happened?
It is even for the atheist historian, it is a remarkably strange story.
Ah,
That this because Jesus is not the only preacher. He's not the only teacher to pop up here or there and start a small following but nothing like this happens.
hmm,
And I mean even you want to draw some comparisons to Muhammad and stuff, but that that movement, that transformation wasn't through preaching, it wasn't through slaves and women, it wasn't from the ground up, that was conquest.
hmm.
And yeah, religions have spread by conquest in many countries and many times. This is very different.
Wow. Wow. So Christianity would have been said to have a PR problem back in the day, to which the only response would have been through grace, all things are possible.
Pretty
Right.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty
So,
much.
so back to Hebrews. What's the overall in Catholic churches? We get it a chapter at a time, interspersed with other readings from other epistles. So, to be honest, I couldn't tell you what's the central thrust of Hebrews as a whole.
So I've been preaching this over and over again in most sermons, but the two kind of major themes, a theological and a practical. The theological is Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God, and then the practical is don't go back, go forward. So the theological, the author of Hebrews begins in chapter 1 talking about how Jesus is superior to the prophets, and then he continues on talking about how he's superior to the angels, and he's superior to Joshua, and he's superior to Moses, and he's superior to Aaron and the Levitical priesthood. And we're in chapter 7 now, where he's talking about the order of Melchizedek and that wonderful little passage, and how Jesus is superior to Abraham and superior to Levi and the whole Levitical priesthood. Jesus is better than, better than, better than, better than. And especially speaking to a Jewish Christian audience, which is what he's doing. He's writing to Jews who have become Christians, but he's writing to them, encouraging them to not go back to Judaism, don't fall back into what for them was a legally permitted religion, Judaism, rather than what is right now an illegal religion, Christianity. Don't fall back to the synagogue. Don't go back to the sacrifices. Don't go back to that way, because Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. That this is the ultimate thing, and so it's not something that you can just lightly set aside. He is better than everything else that you've ever had within Judaism. This is the capstone.
Mm. And it's not that we can be Jews with sort of a pro Jesus allegiance, right? There's
Yeah.
something really radical about this man, Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
You can't just look at him and say, man, he really embodied the values that I try to gain by my attendance at synagogue.
Mhm.
It's like, no,
Yeah.
he really claimed that he was starting something new out of the root of something old.
Mhm. Yeah, and that, I mean, that's his
And is
whole.
that sense in Hebrews as well that that this person Christ is a watershed. You
Yeah,
have to
exactly.
choose.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's taught he in chapter 7 where he's talking about that he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek, and he quotes from Psalm 110 that talks about God appointing a priest forever from that order, and the whole argument right there in chapter 7 is why would God appoint a new priesthood if the Levitical priesthood was sufficient? But right here, right in the middle of the Levitical priesthood in Psalm 110, when David is writing this, so the Levitical priesthood has been around for a couple hundred years. It's going to continue for a couple hundred more years, and already God is declaring that's insufficient. There's something new coming. The whole Jeremiah 31:31. I'm going to make a new covenant with my people, not like the old covenant. It'll be on their hearts, not on stone. It's going to be completely transformed. And this is in the Old Testament. This is in the old covenant, and God is saying, I'm going to make something new. So the author of Hebrews is saying, look, the Old Testament has been pointing to this. It's supposed to come to its fulfillment in Jesus. So you don't go back to the shadows. You don't go back to the foretaste. This is what it was all about from the first point.
Right. Do you think there was then an importance in the the effective end of the Jewish nation, which is chronicled in Maccabees, correct?
Yeah.
Do you think that was sort of important in the sense that the Jewish people needed needed to see their earthly hopes dashed in order to that at least some of them would be receptive to a Messiah that was not talking about an earthly program,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yeah.
did the Savior have to arrive at a time when the Jewish people were still ethnically coherent but nationally just non-existent, right?
Sure.
And they
Yeah.
sort of had their own government in Jerusalem,
Sort of. I
sort of.
mean, Herod, who is not a Jew, is ruling over them, so it's it's pretty minimal.
Okay,
Um, I mean, obviously, in the sovereignty of God, it was fitting. It was the way He planned it to be.
sure.
It's not as if the way it was planned out worked perfectly from the human standpoint. It's not as if the Jews went, "Aha, perfect! This is the Messiah we've been waiting for."
Thank God we were conquered.
Yeah, that was not the universal response.
Right,
So yeah,
because even after the life of Christ, there's Jewish uprisings,
right,
and the Romans come and
right.
truly ruin any national ambitions.
Yeah, yeah, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and I think that's 130. 70 AD, you have the destruction of the temple under Titus, and and I do kind of feel like that was a moment of grace and mercy that Jesus comes in 29, 30. He begins his ministry somewhere 27, 28, 29. There are debates over the exact date, but whatever, somewhere around 30 AD, and dies and rises from the dead, somewhere around 32, 33, whatever. Not particularly important, but then there's a 30-year, 35-ish year grace period, if you will, where the temple's still there, but the message of who Jesus is, of the fulfillment of everything the temple was pointing to, is spreading among the Jews. And then the temple is taken away. and now you can't do the sacrifices anymore. You can make up stuff of, oh, we're somehow fulfilling the Old Testament with our prayers and thanksgiving and worship instead of following the law that God gave us. But the law God gave you is the law God gave you, and there was no new revelation that said, "Oh, your prayers are good enough now." Then you're literally making that up because you can't do the sacrifices anymore. It's not possible. There is no temple. And so the temple's taken away, and you're like, yeah, because that's what Jesus was talking about. And there was that moment of time where you had time to learn, but now you're not allowed to go back to the temple anymore. And I think that's very much on purpose.
When I was in Jerusalem, it was just remarkable to go up to the hill of the temple, and there's there's a mosque there.
Right.
I mean, it's very jarring because you're in this aggressively pro-Jewish environment.
Sure.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you about what happened when we were on the
No,
subway in Tel Aviv?
no.
Like I was trying to find the sign of where we were supposed to get on to our next stop. So I took a backward step or two and I bumped into this older lady, man, and I turned around and I must have felt like every quavering Greek soldier in a canyon in during the Maccabean Revolution, right? I mean, she looked at me as if she wanted to see my head roll in front of the train. She just stared me down. And like she was 70 at least, right? Like I was like 26, right? This was not a fight she could theoretically win, except she won it rhetorically and without words. The rhetoric was just staring at me, right? So yeah, so when I was there, I just had this frankly profound sense of this coiled readiness for violence, eh, not chaos, violence on the part of the Jewish state. I mean, and some of that comes from just the soldiers walking around and everyone's carrying like combat rifles, not pistols, combat rifles. When we walked up to the Temple Mount, you take this long, twisting wooden causeway. It goes back and forth up the hill. And at every turn, there's two or three soldiers with, in addition to combat rifles, like artillery rifles, right? I mean, you get the sense that you could be in the middle of a war zone at the drop of a hat. But then you get to the Temple Mount and you walk out, and every trace of Jewish influence is absent. It's really remarkable. And then you hear the prayer coming from the minaret, and then you're being told, all the women are being told cover your head, and if men are in shorts, they're being like given like kind of these like towel like or skirtish things to like cover their legs. Like it's immediately the the dominant influence of the moment is entirely Islamic. It's really quite stark in the middle of this Jewish dominance of the area. Um, but at any rate, I just think back to back to the first century, right? 35 to 70 AD, and think of this sort of destruction of all hopes of Jewish nationalism, and with that, the destruction of all hopes of the continuity of the Jewish religion. And
Right.
but of course, so Hebrews is written well before that, correct?
Probably not well before.
Okay.
And we're guessing here, of course, but probably 65 to 68, so shortly before.
Shortly. Okay.
Yeah,
So sort of on the
our best
eve.
guess. Yeah,
Okay. Eve of the Jewish uprising.
yeah.
Okay. But nonetheless, the audience is already professing Christians.
Yes.
Okay. So the first half of the book is a focus on how Christ surpasses all of these sort of icons
Yeah.
of the Jewish
Yeah.
religion. So that's the first half. And then the second half is what now?
We'll continue very much in that same vein of Jesus is better than, but we'll continue on to the covenant that he brings is better than the old covenant. The sacrifice that he brings is better than the Old Testament sacrifices. The temple that he brings that is himself rather than this earthly temple it's all of those Old Testament institutions as well as all those Old Testament people are all fulfilled in Jesus. We're all pointing to him. He is the ultimate revelation of God. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
And you said you're going back between this and parts of the Old Testament?
We finished up the book of Exodus last year before Advent.
Okay.
And so that sort of set us up for, here's the Aaronic priesthood and here's the tabernacle and all of the stuff in the tabernacle and, all of those things that now he's going to talk about how, he is better than Aaron, better than Moses, better than
Mm.
all of these people that we've just seen interacting with in Exodus. So.
Okay. Gotcha. Yes, I was there for one of your sermons about Exodus. We had a really fascinating conversation. Moses goes up to the mountain, receives the law, comes back, and people are throwing down. um, I've wondered about this for a long time. Help me out here. Moses leads the people out of Egypt with a series of apparently life-changing miracles. And then he goes for a hike
Well,
and
40 days
40
to be
days.
fair, 40 days.
All right, so help me be fair. What does 40 days mean? Was he gone for a year? Was he gone for 40 literal days?
I mean, I'd take that one as literal.
Okay.
It's probably also symbolic in some sense. You know, the number 40 becomes a symbol of temptations, trials. You see that with, you know, Jesus 40 days, the 40 years in the wilderness. 40 does become a symbolic number, but I have no reason to believe that it's being used here only symbolically. So I'll take it as a literal 40 days that he's up on the mountain.
Okay. Still, that's like a third of a semester.
It's not that long. Yes, and the people completely collapse, and
Is there any sense of like a rival camp, like rival would-be leadership that Aaron is trying to hold at bay by making the golden calf? Like,
if I could make my best excuse for them,
mhm,
it would be two things. First, he goes up this mountain, and the people have already seen that this mountain is shrouded with cloud. There's fire, there's lightning. I mean, this isn't just he went up the mountain. No, this is like storm and chaos, and he went right up into it and hasn't come back for 40 days. So there could be a certain sense of, well, maybe God killed him. Maybe he's not coming back. And then they also, when they turn to Aaron, they in essence say we need a god to go before us. They acknowledge something that is actually true. We need divine protection.
okay.
We can't do this on our own. And that's a very common thing in the ancient world to recognize that you need some god to help you, to protect you against the other gods. You know, you don't want to go around godless. You'll get attacked by anybody. So we need divine protection. We need some god to go with us. And so it seems like Moses is gone. It seems like his God is, I don't know, unhappy. I don't know if he's going to lead us anywhere. We need divine protection, so help us out here.
Okay.
So that's my best defense.
Yep.
At the same time, you see this pattern in Israel's history all the time of the people fall away, the people grumble, they grumble, and you see this in the wilderness over and over again. This is the entire story of the book of Judges. Is, you know, God saves them, they fall away from him, they cry out to God because some oppressor has come in, God saves them again, round and round and round it goes. And the whole story of Judges is not told chronologically. It begins with the best judge and descends to the worst judge. That's the structure of Judges. It's not chronological at all. And the whole point is the people keep on rebelling no matter how many times they fall into this abyss, no matter how many times God rescues them, they keep failing. And obviously it becomes a story of our own souls as well. I mean, yes, it's historical, but it's a mirror of what we do all the time.
Okay. All right. So I'm being a little harsh when I say Moses went for a hike and everyone lost their minds, right? Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, I will admit, it reminds me when I was a little kid, my mom would go to the grocery store and I'd be like at my house, like with my dad, and I'd be like, she's never coming back.
Yeah, it's
I'd be like,
kind of that idea.
I'd be like, this is it. It's over. We're on our own. She'd been gone for like 20 minutes. I remember, I mean, I was a little kid. I'd stare out the back window and be like, yep, it's gonna be me in the window from now on. I was a melancholic little kid.
Yeah. We could have quite the competition between the
Yeah, exactly. Right. We would have been grumbling in the wilderness if we were somewhere in the Sinai desert. I do remember traveling through. So my buddy and I went to Israel, but then we crossed over into Jordan, and so yeah, we we were in Jordan. We got food poisoning, so we were just really in rough shape. But then we had to drive from Jordan back to back to Israel, and so you have to cross the desert. And we had a car. I mean,
Right.
yeah. Um, but I remember traveling through this wilderness, which I think is only maybe 200 linear miles from the Sinai wilderness, and thinking this really does feel like the end of the earth, right? Like sometimes I think in North America, where we have deciduous trees and these pine mountains and rivers and lakes, sometimes I think we read the wilderness and we think like Yellowstone, which is quite pretty. But like some of the wildernesses in the like near equatorial regions of near Asia, I mean, it's rough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is nothing there.
There's nothing there, and there's nothing to eat, and there's no water, right? Like when Moses strikes water from the rock, you think, yeah,
Yeah.
that was necessary. So, but anyway, so yes, you touched on this just a second ago, but it apparently shows up in the story of Aaron upon Moses's return. You said that there's no reason to think that what is happening next is necessarily chronological. Moses dashes the law. He then grinds up the golden calf, casts it upon the water, forces the Israelites to drink, calls upon the Levites to draw their swords and kill the leadership of
Probably.
the rival camp. And it's just this a lot happens. Can you just walk us through the pertinent events and then explain how these events are not necessarily to be taken chronologically, but in order of importance again?
Yeah, I mean, you did a nice job there. He destroys the stone tablets that he's bringing down from the mountain, which both symbolically but also legally in that society, in that world, in the ancient Near East, was a sign of the covenant being broken. This relationship has been broken, and now I break the document that holds that signature, so to speak. So that's the first thing. Then he goes sort of in order of importance, destroys the calf, confronts Aaron, the leadership, and corrects or confronts at least him, and then moves on to the people. But you can tell with the destruction of the calf, and then he makes the people drink it. It seems like that event is probably being drawn from later on because he probably destroys the calf, he confronts Aaron, then destroys the calf, or destroys the calf and then confronts Aaron, and then the Levite enforcement and things are brought back to order, and probably then he makes them drink the ground up golden calf. He probably didn't try to do that before the Levites reestablished order in the camp. But that's
And when we say reestablish order in the camp, we're talking war. I mean, we're talking
3,000 people die.
okay, so a massacre.
I mean, of the whole of the people of Israel at that time, it's not a decimation. It's not quite that number, but
Okay.
but it is a bunch of people, yes.
Wow.
And it is, significant that
Mhm.
that they're wiped out because of what they've chosen to do.
Mhm.
But yeah, because the Hebrew and Greek does this too, but the storytelling often doesn't follow chronological order necessarily. It's because there's a different ordering that's being emphasized, where we're going from the first problem, the golden calf, next problem, Aaron, next problem, the people. You kind of see the same kind of thing in Judges, where we go from worst or best to worst, and we sort of descend. This is a very normal thing where in Hebrew you'll tell three stories, and it'll go from a good story to a better story to the best story, or it'll go from a bad story to a worse story to the worst story. And you see that actually at the end of the book of Judges. You have the what we call the Bethlehem trilogy, where there are three stories that center around Bethlehem. And the first one is the Levite who decides to sort of set up his own tabernacle and start serving as a priest all by himself on his own, and it all is catastrophically and bad, and he's from Bethlehem. And then there's the last story of the book of Judges, where it's the concubine who is from Bethlehem, and they go, I can't remember what city it is, but he gives over his concubine to the crowd to do whatever they want with her, and then takes her back and cuts up her body and scatters it over the tribes, saying, look at how I've been, mistreated. And it's just this catastrophic, terrible story at the end of the book of Judges, because that's how the book of Judges goes. And then, right after the book of Judges, the third Bethlehem story, which is the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth opens with in the time of the judges, and this family leaves Bethlehem because there's a famine, which is ironic because Bethlehem, Beit Lechem, is literally the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means. And there's a famine in the house of bread. And they leave Bethlehem. They go to Moab. So they're leaving the promised land. That's not good. It's the time of Book of Judges. That's not good. There's a famine. That's not good. They marry Moabite women. That's not good. And then they all die. The husband, not Ruth, her mother-in-law. I can't.
Naomi?
Naomi, yeah. Her husband dies. Her two sons die. And they're like, yeah, well, this is what we come to expect in the book of Judges. This is the last story in this trilogy from Bethlehem. Everything goes wrong. And then there's the reversal, and everything changes. You're like, what? We didn't expect this. And it turns out that Ruth is going to be the great whatever it is grandmother of David, and it's this transformative story, but it's built on this premise that we had this really bad story in Bethlehem, we had an even worse story in Bethlehem, and then we started the third story, and it started out real bad, and we expected it to continue real bad. So even in I was just talking about this with some other people. This in the curse in Genesis in the fall, where you have God addresses Adam, and Adam, of course, passes the buck and throws Eve under the bus. And he and then God turns to Eve, and then God turns to the serpent, and then the curse goes in reverse order: serpent, woman, Adam. And so it's a chiastic structure, A, B, C, C, B, A. It builds, and then it centers on the offspring of the serpent, and the offspring of the woman, which of course is Jesus. So ironically, it centers on the Messiah as Adam, sort of bookends each side of that. So wow. So just like there, I don't think it could have happened exactly chronologically that way. I have no problem with that. But the way it's structured in the literature is for a reason. The author has written this in order to put our focus on the offspring, or put our focus on the decline of Israel and their repetitive failure, and how the judges keep on getting worse and worse, which is why Samson is such a bad judge. He comes at the end. Samson is not an admirable figure at all. He's one of the worst judges. But anyway.
Yeah, I guess a little distracted.
Yes, very, very distracted, very disobedient, very dishonoring of his mother and father. I mean, he's a mess, and yet God still uses him. So yeah.
Huh. So that's interesting. So you can say, I mean, we have tropes in our own storytelling. Right. In a dystopian future. Right. You just say, in a dystopian future. 4 words, everyone has an image.
Yep.
Right. There's
zombie apocalypse.
There's zombies, there's cannibals, it's Mad Max. Like there's this sort of cultural image that's just ready to go in a dystopian future. People are there. And so you could say something similar about in the time of the judges. Yep. Oh God, this was as bad as it gets.
It's going to be a bad story.
In the time of the judges. But then there's this really remarkable turnaround, right? When the story gets as bad as one can imagine. Famine, exile from the promised land.
Death.
Right. But relations with outsiders that were forbidden, death. And from there,
and that's when Naomi makes her proclamation, call me Mara. I'm not pleasant, I'm bitter. That's all I have. And and from there suddenly everything starts to change.
The sun comes back. Yeah. What do you think of going and sleeping at the feet of your beloved as a courtship gesture.
Not recommend. No, I do not recommend. I
Forget I kissed dating goodbye and Jason Everett. Like, you want to get to biblical courtship? Let's have go curling up on the hope chest, you know?
it is a strange story. That is certainly the case, and we have no evidence from that time period, extra biblical or biblical, or that this was like a practice or a norm or anything that anyone would have understood.
Oh.
We do not know why Naomi says, no, here's the plan, do this.
Mhm.
It is very, very strange.
Mm.
But it is also fascinating that Ruth is obedient in that moment to Naomi's plan. That as strange as it is, she's like, no, I'll still follow your advice. I've committed to being with you, to serving you, to helping you, and so I'll do what you say here.
Mhm.
And that's kind of remarkable.
Right. Okay. Okay, so let's just go back to the base of the mountain here. So Moses comes back. There's this reckoning. Aaron says something very strange. I threw the jewelry into the fire, and this golden calf came out.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What are we supposed to make of Aaron? I mean, righteous man, sort of a man swayed by the moment. Like, where does the tradition really judge him?
Well, it depends on which tradition.
Which tradition? Okay.
Yeah, there is a very long-standing Jewish tradition of trying to redeem that moment of sort of reinterpreting those events that this really isn't Aaron's fault on some level.
Okay.
I think that's a mistake. I think we're supposed to see the flaws here. In fact, the way it's structured, you see how the Exodus story in this sort of microcosm, we had this covenant between God and his people, just like in Genesis. And then we had this temptation that centers around a beast in Genesis and in Exodus. And the people sin terribly. Death enters the world, and even fratricidal death, actually, in both Genesis and Exodus, the Levites killing their brothers, so to speak, and the death of Cain and Abel, and that whole fratricidal moment there.
Right.
And you have the confrontation, God speaking to Moses and then telling Moses to confront Aaron, and just like God confronts Adam, and Aaron responds just like Adam does by pointing the finger. Adam says, this woman that you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate of it. It's her fault. And really it's your fault, God, because you gave me this woman. And so he throws her under the bus. And Aaron does the exact same thing with the people. This people is evil and wicked and stiff-necked. And you know that they're a hard people to command. And the gold, that whole thing where I crafted it, no. I just threw it in the fire and it popped out. And literally the end of the chapter, it says, the golden calf was destroyed, the one that Aaron made. I mean, it underscores the fact that was a lie. Don't take that as actually what happened. He was lying.
Right.
So they set up this parallel of the Genesis story and this Exodus story are echoes. There's this connection that the people of God are again failing after God has again made a covenant with them. And again, there's this temptation to throw other people under the bus and not take responsibility yourself. And again, God is going to redeem them despite their unworthiness for this. And, so it continues that grace of God theme running through the whole thing.
Yeah. Wow. I suppose we could probably be a little easier on the people because there were probably generations that converted, sort of returned to righteousness, generally died out. And then in the next cycle of sin and corruption, it was perhaps not those same group of people.
Yes.
It might have been children or grandchildren, right? We do read the people, and it's like, God, yeah, that same damn crowd of people again. You won't learn, but this is over hundreds of years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the work of the law and the purpose of God in the redemptive history is that the author of Amazing Grace has this line about how, you know, no one really can be told they're a sinner. They have to be shown that they're a sinner. Um, and and so you kind of have this epic history of Israel, the people of God, God making covenants with them and being gracious to them, and then demonstrating you can't keep it. And the first generation, oh well, they were slaves in Egypt, so maybe the next generation will be better. No, they're not better. Maybe the next generation will be better. No, they're not better either. Maybe the next generation. This isn't a bug; it's a feature. This is not just if we can get all of the dials set perfectly, we'll finally have a generation of people that will keep the law perfectly and keep the covenant perfectly,
Ah,
and everything will go smoothly. No, no, none of you can do it, and that's why it's
the
all
point
pointing to
is that you can't
is you
do it.
can't do it, and you need to be shown that you can't do it so that you understand your need for a Messiah, for a
Okay.
better covenant.
Right, right. That when the Messiah comes, you understand what problem it's solving,
Right.
which is we've been trying to fly. It's not a matter of flapping our arms harder.
Yeah, and it's not a problem with this generation or the next or the next. It's never gonna get fixed
Yeah,
without God doing something else.
without doing right, and something very dramatic. Do we have any sense, jumping back forward into the New Testament, back into Hebrews and the time period? Do we have any indication that there is a element of Judaic practice that is trying to accept Jesus as another prophet or another leader or another good moral teacher, but doesn't quite want to make that jump to savior? Like they don't want to condemn him.
Sure. I don't think we really see much of that. Um, because despite what some readers of the New Testament will say today, Jesus' claims about himself are so very obvious to a Jewish audience. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when he says things like, before Abraham was, I am, and they pick up stones to kill him because they know he's invoking the divine name there. Yahweh, I am, and so they know exactly what he's talking about. So there isn't nearly as much ambiguity as some authors today are like, oh no, he was just a good teacher. He really doesn't leave
Explain
that
the
door open.
stones, you idiot.
He just doesn't leave that option open. And so what you do see that the author of Hebrews seems to be addressing, and you see in some extra biblical stuff, Chrysostom, the Bishop of Constantinople, later on will talk about how there are members of his congregation who are also going to the synagogue on Saturdays on Sabbath and trying to keep sort of one foot in both worlds, sort of hedge their bets, if you will,
Or not
and
break with a community.
maybe, and he's pretty harsh. That no, that Christ is the ultimate revelation of God. You don't go back to Judaism. You need to acknowledge the fulfillment that comes in Christ. I mean, he obviously Chrysostom's writing long after the temple is gone, and he's like, no, that's done with. That's fulfilled. That's completed. You don't have one foot in both worlds. Be a Christian. Be a part of the church. That's what you're called to. So
Wow. Yeah.
so that seems to be more of the danger that you find addressed among Jewish Christians in the early church is this temptation to try and kind of have it both ways.
Sure.
And that might have been part of what the author of Hebrews is dealing with too, because he talks about persecution in that letter, how they've begun to be persecuted, not to the point of martyrdom, but they've begun to lose property. They've become Some of them have become arrested and imprisoned and stuff, and so there would be an understandable temptation to sort of go, well, I can just practice Judaism. And the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. It's the same as the Messiah. So I'm not really betraying Jesus here. And this way I have legal cover and nobody's going to mess with me.
Mm.
And you can understand why that would be a temptation.
That's noxious, right? Yeah, it's true. Right. Who among us are truly willing to lose our houses
Yeah,
and
yeah,
jobs and
that's not an easy danger to run on a regular basis.
no, no, especially especially for lay people living in the world where the human prudence has some claim on you, right?
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you have children or
Yeah.
people dependent on you
Yeah.
generally.
Yeah. Even just an extended family. Yeah.
Hmm. Right, right. What what is responsible citizenship and what does it demand of you? That's tough.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why there's that theological and practical theme going back and forth in Hebrews of Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. This is not just something tacked on to Judaism. This is the central point that everything was leading to. So you can't just set it aside and act as if it's not an important part of this conversation.
Wow.
And so don't go back.
Mhm.
Don't go back into sin, which is normally what we think, but also don't go back to Judaism. Don't go back to the shadows. Don't go back to the pre-incarnate Christ.
Right.
The sort of vision of reality that was all building to this moment. That's foolishness, and
We
that's
brought
why.
you to the sanctuary. Don't go back to the foyer.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why he spends so much time talking about how this sacrifice is so much better than the blood of bulls and goats. This covenant is so much better than the last, and this priesthood is eternal and perfect, and
Mm.
because he's trying to underscore the fact that there's no need for any of those other things anymore.
Right. Right. One thing that I've often heard claimed around the epistles generally is that the authors were probably expecting the return of Christ in their own lifetime. Is that true? Is that true?
Uh, I mean, it's obviously a bit of a guess to say what did Paul think in his own head
Hmm.
about this. Um, I would not be bothered by the idea that many of them thought Jesus was going to return in 10 to 25 years. That would not bother me to think that some of them believed that internally. I don't think that's what they were saying when they wrote the epistles and said some of the things that bother us when they talk about looking forward to the return of Christ and the imminence of that. I don't think those statements need to be read as guarantees that he was coming back shortly, but rather the importance of living in light of his return.
Mm.
That we don't know when that is, but we are called to set our hearts, our minds, our eyes on that return. That we're not going to be able to fix this world. That we ultimately are waiting for that work.
Mm.
So yeah, some of them probably did believe that, but they wouldn't be unique. There have been Christians throughout the centuries who have thought, 10 more years and he's going to be here. In 500 there was a big movement. In 1000 there was a big movement that it's 1,000 years since Christ came, and if you do the math in this particular way, he's coming back. And the big millennial movements in the 1500s before the Reformation, where there were all this stirrings of Christ is going to soon return, and people were selling their possessions and wandering about and tearing down houses and doing all kinds of things. Like, they were committed to Christ coming back in the next couple of years, and they were wrong. So, and then the 1800s, there's in America there were all kinds of movements like that, and then Y2K and various other predictions. I mean, yeah, you get those kinds of predictions, and some of that I think is
What's the
nonsense, but
what's the appeal there? I mean, it seems to me that of all the appeals about prognostications for the future, this one is so specifically warned against
yes, that's the funny
in
part.
in the scriptures that these people are professing to be disciples of, right? Like, don't worry about it.
Right. You're
Seems
not
to be
gonna know.
it seems to be a general message. You neither know the day nor the hour. And then you have people not just sitting around in easy chairs saying, "Yeah, I think, yeah, right. I think if you do the math," and then like, no, they're selling houses, they're selling their cars. I mean, man, I wish I could meet a few people and buy their houses. But that's the world talking right there. What? You want to give me your house for $10? Sure. I'll take it. So can you track that culturally? Like,
Yeah, I don't know.
there's this specific warning about not trying to figure it out, and yet so many people try to figure
Yeah.
out. I mean, is it just Is it an expression of the impatience we have with the tension of this earthly life?
Yeah, that's probably
Oh,
part
God,
of
wouldn't
it.
it be nice if this was over?
I think
I wouldn't have to go to work every day.
I think we've probably all prayed that prayer before we the
Yeah,
big test. You know,
right.
Lord Jesus, come soon.
Right.
Come now, before I have to take this
I'll
test.
take my chances before the divine judge, before I take this calculus 2 exam.
Exactly. Uh, I think part of it is because there are signs and warnings that some people end up reading and thinking, well, I can figure it out. I can do it. I can put it all together. And so that's
God
tempting.
has chosen me to
Yeah,
figure it out.
yeah. And there's that pride and human beings are knowing creatures. We are made in the image of God, and I think part of that is that we are made to know things. God
Hmm.
knows things perfectly and completely, omnisciently. We know things partially, but we were made to know things. There is a joy in learning and in knowing, and just like any capacity, it can be misused, and any joy and pleasure can be, twisted.
Yeah.
And the joy of I have a secret knowledge that you don't. I figured something out that you didn't.
Hmm.
That's an understandable temptation.
Right. Well, I suppose anyone could look at those warnings in scripture and say, well, that's a warning for that generation, right? For those people, for that
Sure.
audience.
Sure.
God is speaking to me today, and he needs me to tell you
Yeah.
we need to be on that hilltop
And
at 11 o'clock at night in 3 months, 6 days.
and there's always that temptation of the crisis, that the crisis removes the normal rules. And you're allowed to do things in a crisis that you're not normally allowed to do. And if it's a crisis, then you should give me all your money, and because we need to do this now, and you should drop your job and join my ministry, and you should, all of the things that a crisis allows you to do, that it's urgency and it's exciting and it's movement, and you can see why that can get a crowd worked up. That can create a sense of power and meaning and purpose.
Yeah. 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 Speaking, I think we mentioned this last time you were on here, but he never fails to amuse me when he gets the crowd worked up. But Joel Osteen, did I tell you about that new caricature of him? I think the
No,
Babylon Bee put it out. It
no.
said, Joel Joel Osteen buys a new yacht narrow enough to fit through the eye of a needle.
Oh man.
It's so good because it's showing one of these super yachts, which
Sure.
from 200 feet up, they do look pretty narrow, right? They're super long, right? Relatively speaking. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I saw that. Yeah, I don't think I got any work done that day. Yeah, every time I have a needle. Ah, yeah.
Somebody's gonna build the world's biggest needle just to
Just
see. I can fit all of my possessions.
all right.
through
Through
this
this needle. Right. The Lord has called me to demonstrate to you. Well, I think that is a understandable temptation in the sense that so many of the Psalms talk about physical and material well-being,
Mhm.
right? Honor the Lord, and your house shall be blessed. You shall see your children's children, and your wife shall be like a fruitful vine on the side of your house, right? Like, I feel like there's stuff you can go in and cherry pick out of
Oh,
Scripture that really does suggest to you material well-being, right?
And material well-being clearly is a blessing from God,
Hmm.
both in the Old Testament and honestly, I believe as a Christian, the material world was made by God and is good.
Mm.
So so it's not as if that's not a blessing. The problem is when second things become first.
Hmm.
And the problem is when we take wisdom literature, like in the Proverbs, and we try to make it legal literature, you know.
Oh, okay. Help me out there with the lingo.
Well, like we see these proverbial statements about, teach a child in the way he should go and he will not depart from it. Well, that's a proverbial statement about instructing a child is helpful for how they will grow up. But prodigal children happen.
Ah,
Yeah, that's not a promise. That's not a guarantee. That's not a law. In the same way that, the Proverbs back to back have, answer a fool in his wisdom, don't answer a fool in his wisdom. Back to back statements where it says to do opposite things. Because it's proverbial wisdom. It's giving you all kinds of different principles to have in your head. And when you come into a unique situation, you're supposed to think through, okay, what is the principle that applies here? How do I respond to this situation? Is this the kind of fool that I may actually be able to answer and help? Or is this the kind of fool where I can just walk away? There's nothing to do
Right,
here.
right. Right. Shall we cast our pearls before swine?
Right.
No, yeah. Don't cast your pearls before swine. That might suggest to you silence in a given situation. But then also do not hide your light under a bushel basket. That might suggest action or outspokenness in a given situation.
Yeah.
Neither are prescriptions for every situation,
Exactly.
unfortunately.
And yes, and as Americans, as legalists, as very literal thinkers and readers as we tend to be, I think in the modern world, we're like, no, I want wooden, literal, exact, and apply it everywhere. It's like that is not how most literature ever is written, let alone how much of scripture is written.
Interesting. Yeah. That's always occurred to me when I see people join certain movements, right? Karapi, certain people running after some high profile exorcists or people who claim to have a real inside track on Ignatian spirituality, right? And there's this draw to, oh, this person is the channel for prescriptions for every situation in my life.
Right.
And I'll be relieved of the duty of having to weigh two prescriptions,
Mm-hmm.
right? This person will relieve me of that duty, and that would be such a relief. It'd be like a second coming. Like, oh God, I don't have to take the test because it's all over.
Right. I think that's the attraction of most cults,
Mm,
honestly, is that they just answer all these questions for me.
right.
They deal with all of these problems. I don't have to think about this. I think you can even see this in political environments sometimes
Mm,
where, I am tribe X. So whatever tribe X believes, I believe. Now I don't need to think about this anymore.
right.
I just don't have to worry. I don't have to wrestle through it. I don't have to read the opposing literature and go through all the arguments. This is hard and boring and tedious. I can just be X and I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very tempting. It's a relief.
Right. Yeah, I was listening to a Rogan episode, and his guest was saying, I think one thing that American education lacks is teaching young people how hard things are. Like, do you know how long it takes to become good at something? Right. Yeah, it takes so long to do it, and it's so boring along the way. Yeah, I was talking to someone who had gone through law school, but she wasn't working a law job. I said, "What gives?" And she said, "Well, basically, I had the experience that many law students have. They love law school and they hate practicing law." Right? Because it's just the same tedious
Sure.
turnings of the gears inside a certain system again and again and again in the hopes that over time you start moving the ball uphill. But who's to say that you will? Who's to say that the progress will be visible? There's no guarantee. Yeah. Yeah. And probably if you stick with it, you probably will move the ball uphill. But inside a 3 or 4 year window, you might just not see any of that.
That might seem much.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So I sent you this question earlier, and I'm gonna say it a bit provocatively, but during his earthly ministry and his earthly life, was Jesus sometimes a pain in the butt?
Well, I mean, certainly he was provocative.
It was provocative.
I think that's fair to say.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't think you can read his comments about, you are unwashed tombs, the statements about being a pit of vipers, there are statements, the den of robbers, turning over the tables in the temple. There are definitely moments where he is very provocative. He is very much stirring things up.
Mhm.
That's true. He is not afraid of or avoidant of confrontation all the time.
Okay.
And I think we can go back to the proverbial wisdom thing. Sometimes he doesn't avoid confrontation, and sometimes he does.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, when this is particularly common in the Gospel of Mark, when he tells people not to tell the story of what just happened. You know, keep this quiet, keep this under your hat, don't tell people about this. Where it's like, why? Why are you holding back people from telling these stories? And the only explanation that makes any sense to me is more or less that he understood how provocative this was, what he was doing, and how too much of this getting around would bring about the conflict with the Pharisees before the right time. That yes, that's coming. Yes, they are going to crucify me. Yes, that is part of the plan, but we're not going to bring about that too soon. And so there are times when he avoids confrontation in that sense, not in a cowardly sense, but in the sense of, you know, he doesn't he's not as provocative as has to be or anything, you know.
Right.
But yeah, he definitely can be difficult, can be challenging. I mean, the beautiful contrast between Zacchaeus and the woman at the well. Those are back to back chapters in the Gospel of John, and he talks to Zacchaeus, who is or I'm sorry, is it Zacchaeus or Zechariah? I'm maybe botching the name, but he talks to him about how you are a teacher of the law and yet you don't understand what it means to be born again, and you're asking these questions about how can a man re-enter his mother's womb, and you don't understand anything. And he's talking about water and the baptism by water and the spirit, and it's clearly this like challenging, confusing, difficult. And then the next scene is him with the woman at the well, and he's talking to her again about water and about baptism and about worship, and uses much easier language to understand. He speaks to her in a way that she can comprehend, and she doesn't fully understand what is going on here, but clearly recognizes this is a man of God. This is a prophet. This is someone who knows everything about me and answers questions amazingly. And so you have this, you know, to one he's challenging and difficult, and to the one he's very gracious. And you know, I think you see that throughout Jesus.
This is the woman who had 5 husbands.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
and the man you are with right now isn't your husband.
Right. Right. And that incident closes so oddly. It's like where where the townspeople make a point of coming back to the woman and saying, "Oh, we believe in him because of what we saw, not because of what you said." And then the story ends. You're like,
Okay.
what the hell is going on here? They just got to get in there and just twist the knife one last time. Not because of you, honey. Drawn water in the middle of the day, which suggests that she was a outcast among at least the women of the community.
Yes.
That she was doing it alone in the middle of the day.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that she was married that many times in that culture is almost certainly not her doing. She almost certainly had no control over that.
Oh,
She almost certainly was barren. You know, given that there's no mention of any children, and given that, you know, barrenness was a common, you know, reason for divorcing a woman in the ancient world, that's probably what's going on there. Is she is being treated very badly,
okay.
is barren, and therefore seen as an outcast, and is therefore generally rejected by the people, which is probably what that final moment is about. The further
Christ leaves and sort of, unfortunately, the social hierarchy sort of
It's still
reasserts
there.
itself.
is still there.
Right. Which, what are we supposed to make of that? Like, well, okay, Christ leaves, but the work of conversion is not yet done. Ugh. Ugh.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not great. I guess, yeah, she's converted. Right.
And maybe some of them are.
Mm. Right. Ugh. Have you spent much time thinking what was it like to be a friend? There must have been an element of friendship for the disciples following Christ around for those years. Have you ever? I have spent some time thinking about, okay, so what did Peter and Jesus, or James and John, or one of the relatively less prominent disciples, right? Like, what did Philip and Jesus talk about?
Mhm.
right? Did they? It has been said to me that one of the clearest things about that comes through in the Gospels is the sense of mission that Christ had. He's not here to shoot the shit, right? He's not here to make you feel good, but at the same time, if he came back, if he was here as a man, there must have been this human element.
Sure.
Do we have any sense from scriptures of what that might have looked and felt like?
Yeah, I don't think we really do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he almost certainly was teaching as a rabbi would teach his disciples,
Okay.
because then when he sends them out, presumably they have a store of his teaching of
Okay.
what he has been
Like when
teaching.
they go out two by two.
Yeah, when they go out two by two, there's a couple of missions that he sends them out on, depending on how many of these are overlapping from the Gospels and all that. But there's at least two, maybe more, when he does that, and so presumably he's teaching them from the Old Testament, which is what he does in the synagogue a couple of times when he opens the scroll of Isaiah and stuff. So he's probably teaching them from the Old Testament, teaching them what the Old Testament means, says, and presumably how he is the fulfillment of that.
Okay.
So that's probably a part of what's going on. But like the friendship side of it, I don't know.
There's just nothing.
Yeah,
There's
there's
there's not anything to read into.
not really, and some of those would be particularly fascinating, like the questions of like the zealot versus Matthew, and who's a tax collector, and these are politically speaking, the opposite sides of the spectrum, the people who are working with Rome and the people who want to kill the Romans. This is kind of the
This would be the equivalent of having uh, a MAGA supporter and a far left,
yeah,
far left progressive in your same club,
pretty much.
and they have to get along. Or
Well, see, that's the question.
or
How well did they get? I don't know. Was that the pairing? That would have been fun. You two,
you two.
have to do this together. I don't know. We don't know. And I'd just love to know what some of those fireside chats were between them as they were talking about, you're a sellout and you should have been murdering the Romans. I mean, because presumably they were not instantaneously saint-like.
Yeah.
No different than Peter was not instantaneously saint-like, and all that. So yeah, presumably there were lots of rough edges and lots of very interesting conversations, and maybe Jesus stepped in as mediator sometimes. That would be fascinating, but yeah, we just really aren't told.
Hmm.
I feel like the most prominent one is when James and John are talking about sitting at his right hand.
Right.
And all the other guys are like, whoa.
Whoa, 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 whoa. We need to talk about this.
I got dibs. Yeah. I got dibs on the right hand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's about as close as we got.
Because I think it says like all the other apostles get indignant towards them.
Hmm.
And they're
Yeah.
like, well, that's probably a strong word, So they probably were pretty upset.
They were probably pretty upset. And then there's that fun moment in the upper room when he says one of you's gonna betray me, and they're all like, is it gonna be you? Is it gonna be you? Is it gonna be who is it? Who is it? That's fascinating that they didn't immediately go, Judas, he's wearing a black cowl in the corner and he's
Right.
got a long mustache. Obviously it's him. but but
Yeah.
it's interesting that they're literally looking around at each other going, who is gonna do that? And so yeah, I don't know what that means, but
Yeah. Maybe they looked at each other and thought, maybe you don't uphold the mission guard the way I do, or the way James and I do. Could it be you? I don't know. Oh.
That'd be kind of interesting.
Hmm.
I wonder if
yeah.
we probably get to see it one day,
Yeah, I think that absolutely will be part of the eternal learning process of the new heavens and new earth. Will be, you can sit down and have those conversations with everyone.
Sure. Yeah, it just strikes me as interesting that this isn't this isn't something that's well understood. Both sides of this coin, right? That we engage with Christ as a teacher and Messiah, good, but he says, I call you friends,
Mhm.
right? And how many of us can truly say that we have an experience of true human friendship that could even teach us what that means? So, how many of us can even say that, right?
Yeah.
That might be an increasingly rare thing. But let's suppose that you do. How how do we understand friendship with a man who is also the savior and your savior?
Right.
Uh, but so what's the scope and the shape and the dimensions of that friendship? Uh, Someone once said to me, and the gadfly that was Christ a pain in the butt. I mean, that comes from someone saying to me at a seminar one time that he he wondered if perhaps there was something unbearable and insufferable about a saint, right? It's like if they're really answering to a higher order,
Hmm.
are they just sort of bothersome? Because they're bothersome to the spirit of the world.
Hmm.
And to the extent that the spirit of the world reigns in your heart, that probably means they're going to be bothersome to you,
Sure.
right? Was Ignatius of Loyola or Thomas More, were they just kind of, oh, Thomas, let it go?
But at the same time, you see Jesus eating and drinking with sinners.
Yes, yes. And I wanted to know what those conversations were like as well.
And obviously we don't know like word for word all of those conversations, but
Mm,
we do know Jesus wasn't compelling them to be there.
mm,
It's not as if he could force them. That they were coming to him because he was enjoyable to be with.
right. Hmm.
That his holiness was attractive in
Mm,
some sense. And I think that is perhaps an indictment of some Christians that their holiness is not very attractive.
well, you ask, is it really holiness?
And
Maybe
then yes, that then is it
is it
really
really just
holiness at
piety?
all?
Or sorry, a personal liturgy of piety.
Sure. Yeah. A holier than thou external facade, not really that which made tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners want to eat and drink with him,
Hmm.
want to
And
spend
put up
time
with
with
each other's company,
him.
right?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, yeah, yeah. So I do see your point that there is a chafingness, and insofar as the world is in my heart, there's going to be a chafing there.
Mm,
But there does seem to be two very different camps: those who recognize that they are sinners
hmm
and seem to be much more comfortable with Jesus, and those who do not recognize that they are sinners, the Pharisees,
hmm
who say, well, no, we have Abraham as our father, we have kept the law, we tithe the mint and the cumin, we are keeping the law in all of its details. They're the ones who are the most angry, the most upset, and they're the ones that Jesus is the harshest with.
Uh-huh.
But that also may not be a comfort because that means Jesus was the harshest with the religious elite of his day. Those who knew the Bible really well, knew the Old Testament really well, and they were very careful about following its prescriptions, and they were the farthest
Mm,
from him.
right.
And that's kind of terrifying.
It's terrifying. Yeah. What's that great paragraph at the end of Screw Tape when Screw Tape is giving a toast to the
Yeah,
Academy,
yeah.
right? And he's sort of ambivalent about the food,
Hmm.
and he is sort of walking through the necessary courtesies of hell. But then at the very end, he says, "Oh, wait, what is this? Oh my goodness. I unsay all my harsh words about the dinner, for I see that you have preserved a great vintage for us." The Pharisee. Goodness gracious. There's nothing like the sin that exists close to the altar. And that's how the book
Oh,
ends.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Ha!
oh,
Yeah,
Yeah. What were the Pharisees? Okay, so the Pharisees had some level of political control inside the bounds of Jerusalem and the surrounding area.
some, not much.
Some.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Sadducees
They-
were much more powerful within that sphere.
okay.
The Sadducees were much more in the Greek sympathizing, let's blend in with them culturally as much as possible and make everything work.
Okay.
The Pharisees were much more the hard line, conservative, traditional religiosity. So they had a great deal of honor and respect from the Jewish community,
Okay.
but not nearly
That's
as
what they stood to lose.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. They stood to lose prestige, honor, status. You know,
But not direct political
but
power.
yeah, not direct political power.
Okay. So when they approach Pilate or Herod, they approach him as an outsider.
Yeah, that somebody that he has to deal with and deal with carefully because they have honor and sway and influence with the people, and you don't want to get things too sideways here.
Mhm.
But no, they're not a powerhouse in the sense of they don't hold offices or they don't have massive wealth.
They're not cozy.
That's not the issue.
Hmm. So
And
they
that's
were
the
they were influencers.
yeah. Yes, they were influencers. That's the strangeness of the Sadducees and the Pharisees working together.
Ah,
Normally, they're at each other's throats.
okay.
Normally, those two groups hate each other. And the Herodians are also mentioned as you know in one of the gospels as working with them for the downfall of Jesus. And you know, that's a third group who are normally at odds with everybody else because they all have their own plans, ambitions. The Pharisees are all about you know reestablishing the independence of Israel, and if everybody can keep the Sabbath, then the Messiah will come. And you know we are all about the religiosity side of it. And the Sadducees are like, no, this is the Roman Empire. Let's be political realists here. There's no way we're beating them. So let's just get on board with this whole you know Greek culture thing and make it mesh as best as possible. And you know there was even strange documentation to start reading about. There was even uh, a uh, a surgery that you could do to sort of undo circumcision that
Whoa.
became a
Oh,
thing.
oh,
Paul mentions this in First Corinthians when he's talking about how neither circumcision nor uncircumcision matters, and he explicitly tells them don't worry about don't try and reverse your circumcision is you know one of the things he mentions there, and so naturally I was like I don't even know how that's possible, so I I started doing research into what was going on in the ancient world that Paul was talking about, and yes, this was a thing, and
gosh.
to make and of course it was because of Greek culture, because of the Greek bathing together in large groups and the nudity that came along with that and the Olympics and all of the nudity of the sports and stuff. Therefore, circumcision or the lack thereof was very noticeable, and so some Jews were tempted to fit in better with Greek society by doing that. So, anyway, more than you wanted to know.
It's funny.
Well, it didn't come up in Sunday school. I'll tell you that. Yeah. Jeez Louise. Oh my gosh.
Get
Yeah.
home. Mom's like, "How's Sunday school?" Well,
Well,
a little interesting.
yeah. I learned something today. I don't think I should repeat it. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, growing up, if we were out, we saw, some movie trailer, we saw something on the news or we saw something kind of risque, like, just walking around, we would run it by dad, like, Dad, XYZ happened. And he's okay. Keep it to yourself. Yeah. Yeah, oh man, that's funny. Okay, so this is interesting. So there was this sort of corruption of the true purpose of unity in the unity of the Herodians, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. They actually were united, right? This is actually something that's mentioned in Matthew, that from that day Herod and
Yes, yeah.
and Pilate were friends from thereafter, but before they had been enemies.
Yeah.
Is that Luke or is that Matthew?
I think that's Matthew.
Okay.
I'd have to double check, but I'm
Okay.
pretty sure it's not Luke.
Okay. Right, but again, yeah, there's this little appendix
Yeah.
of the story. Like, oh, and by the way, there's this hellish mockery of friendship
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
the scandal of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And there's a strange fulfillment of Jesus' words there that he came to both divide and unite.
Oh, okay.
And you naturally think of that in terms of, the division that comes with those who follow Christ and those who choose to reject Christ. But you don't normally think of the uniting of those who have departed from Christ or rejected him, that there's also a kind of uniting and dividing that goes on there too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something I've been thinking about recently, and this is why I pinged you on politics earlier today, is that to paint with very broad strokes, it seems that on both sides of the political aisle, there's a desire to paint a picture of a brighter future. Now, if that's something that's coming out of Davos saying you will own nothing and be happy, which we might have to talk to their PR department about how effective that is, right? Or you know, or something from the other side of the political aisle saying like, oh, now because of this political moment, we have a chance to really shape the future in a way that's really bright, right? This is Patrick Bet David's line, the future looks bright, which I have no objections to out of the gate. But do you see danger in any version of the future is bright? Like, does that get away from a really essential Christian message that the real brightness is always on the other side of heaven? I mean, to what extent can Christians get on board with building a better future, saving the world?
Well, obviously there is that call to, pray for the city that you're in, that it might prosper, the
Mm.
do justice, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. So
Mm-hmm.
there is very clearly a call to action, to doing justice, to seeking mercy, to bringing about good laws, good governance, caring for the widow, the orphan, the alien in the land. All of those things are
Mm.
speaking to who God is and who we are meant to be as his people and as followers of Christ. So I think that's all valid. I think the danger comes when we think that if we just pass the right laws and get the right people into the political offices, if in other words, if we have all of the power, then then it'll all work out just fine. That's when I think we get into a lot of danger. That
Mm.
we forget the age old problem that all of the victories in this life are temporary and all of the defeats are temporary too, politically speaking,
Mm-hmm.
legally speaking. Laws get passed and they also get repealed. Cases get decided and they also get reversed.
Mm-hmm.
Politicians get elected and they get kicked right back out. This is shows up in the Psalms, that statement about, put not your faith in princes.
Right.
The
But also, the prince does not bear the sword in vain, right?
true.
Like,
But the psalmist in that psalm continues when he's talking about don't put your faith in princes. He goes on to point out, because the prince always dies.
mm,
So his deeper understanding of why you don't trust the princes of this life isn't because they're necessarily all corrupt. No. Some of them are good and some of them are bad, and they're all really a mixed bag. But no matter how good a ruler, a governor is, he's always going to die. He's always going to die. And
Yeah.
and so if your hope is in this life, this law, this country, this president, this politician, this Congress, this, Dobbs, whatever, if your hope is in those things, they're all going to pass away. So
mm,
it's not that you shouldn't work for good governance, good laws, good judiciary. All of those are good things. All those are worthy. But when you invest too much value in them, then you have a problem, because you don't recognize that all of this is not going to last.
mm-hmm.
Ultimately, like we were talking about before, ultimately your eyes, your heart needs to be set on the return of Christ, because that's when things get set right permanently.
Mm,
And if you don't have that vision, that desire, then you're going to be very disappointed when this president dies and the next president dies and the next president. Reagan was wonderful. And no problem saying he was a good president in many respects, but he dies.
mm-hmm.
Everybody dies. So
Mm.
put not your faith in princes.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's always the twilight of any political career, as
Right.
bright as it may be.
Or any political movement. I mean, good grief, we're seeing that with the pro-life movement and all of the transformations that it's going through. I don't want to say death, but the changes that are now happening as Trump is very much of the states decide, and we're gonna hands off and we're pulling the pro-life plank from the platform, the
Mm.
Republican platform. It's like, okay, well, I'm not even saying he's wrong on all of those things. I'm saying that's transformative. I mean, Dobbs was transformative. Like, okay, so the goal for decades was this, and now we're done with that. And now everybody seems totally flat-footed when it comes to passing state legislation and talking and convincing people on a, human level.
Mm.
And yeah, it changes. It's
Mhm.
always going to change. There's always going to be another victory and a defeat. That doesn't mean don't work towards it. It means, be balanced.
Right. And I suppose that what's the some mantra? It's if you accept the suck, it sucks less, right? So if you accept that, yeah, there's going to be ups and downs and vicissitudes of fortune, then the vicissitudes of fortune are in fact a lot easier to bear,
Sure.
right? And Louis L'Amour has a great line: "Stampeded by neither victory nor setback." Yeah. Right. I mean, of
Yeah.
course, it's agri. You're right. Of course, it's a ref. Of course, he puts it in the terms of the agricultural West, right? Yeah, your heart is stampeded by neither thing. So, um, yeah, I am very curious about it because it seems to me that politics does have an effect on our soul.
Sure.
And politics does, like we were talking about earlier, politics does have some effect on the creation of culture.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not intentionally. It is also a product of
It
culture.
always does affect culture too.
Uh, so, to what degree can we really extend our talent, treasure, and time towards these temporary victories? To what extent do we believe that this might actually contribute to the salvation of the people that our political climate will affect or even control?
And I think it's helpful to restructure sort of the work of the Christian, not in terms of saving individual people,
Mm,
but in glorifying God, enjoying Him forever. That's the Westminster Catechism, the way it talks about it. But
mm,
that we are made in God's image, and we are meant to image Him forth. And yes, that does mean proclaiming Christ, but that also can mean making things good and
mm,
beautiful. That transforming a house from a wreck to a beautiful dwelling is a godly thing to do, in the sense of God is the master creator of
mm.
good and beautiful things, and I am made in His image, and I am a sub creator under Him, and I'm going to make something beautiful and good and solid, and I'm going to make this toilet work, and that is a good and beautiful thing. I mean, it's that sort of
Or
idea.
at the very least, the alternative.
The
The alternative sure ain't.
So I think we need to broaden our vision there, of saying
Mm,
you can use time, talent, and treasure in a multitude of ways
mm,
to glorify God in a God honoring, and in a way that points to God, that images forth who He is, the good, the true, and the beautiful, to borrow from Plato there. That is part of what we are called to do.
mm,
And so it doesn't have to be restricted to full-time ministry or missions or church services or the mass. No. This broadens out both to any time of loving your neighbor and all of that, of course, but also to all kinds of tiny minor good deeds of making something beautiful that was not before.
sure. Is it Corinthians where the counsel is whatever your work, do it as if for the glory of God,
You
not
got me
just
on the
for men?
spot. I don't remember.
No, well, I mean, trust me. If there's a person on one side of the table that can quote scripture and have the chapter and verse at the fingertips, it's you. Yeah,
That is scripture, and it is in the epistles.
yeah.
I can't tell you which one at the,
All
at the
right, all
moment.
right. That might we won't yeah, we won't push it past that because man, us Catholics, man, we suck at like the chapter and verse stuff. Yeah, I just say, oh, it's somewhere in scripture.
Well, and I am not one for deliberately memorizing chapter and verse very much,
Really?
just because the chapter and verse is not in the original text.
Mm-hmm.
It's added later. It's useful. Nothing
Mm-hmm.
wrong with it. It's just it's not necessary.
Yep.
And I would far rather someone know that chapter 8 of Romans is about the goodness and beauty of what God does, and chapter 7 is about the struggle of the Christian life, and chapter 2 is talks about condemnation. Chapter 1 also the judgment of God. I would rather you have sort of a general feel for these passages than to be able to quote a single verse totally out of context and have no idea what came before it and what came after it and what the argument of that letter or that author, what's going on there,
Mm.
because that gets proof texting all the time. You end up in a mess. What is the old saying? A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text.
Yes.
Don't do that.
Yep.
So I'm not big on memorizing a particular verse.
Mm.
I'm much more big on knowing, okay, this is what Exodus is about.
Wow. So we talked about melancholic moments as children. I remember listening to something on Focus on the Family, James Dobson.
Yes.
He had some guest on, who just whipped out some quote, like, well, whenever I face these moments, I always turn back to First Colossians, blah, blah, blah. And again, I mean, I must have been like 9 or 10 years old and being like, is this how you prove your bona fides in this environment? You just got these, you can just sling that text out of scripture. It's like going to a bar at in a climber's town and like walking in and just like slinging beta about certain rock climbs that are in the area. It's like you got that hook up at the cliff at the edge of the 510, and after that it really turns into a 511. It's really gnarly. And I'm like, is this just a different beta slang for a different
Can be.
a different environment?
If you look at the Magnificat,
Mm,
Mary's song, there are so many scriptural references, citations,
mm,
allusions all throughout that.
okay.
I think that's more what it should look like.
Okay.
That it's not supposed to be like, as First Corinthians 7:12 says. No. It's supposed to be, I can just talk about any topic: justice, humility, love, good, whatever. And there are allusions, connections, and the language of scripture has influenced my thinking on this to the point that I don't even necessarily realize that I'm quoting or that language comes from this verse or that chapter, but it's influenced my thinking, so it's just seeped in. And
Hmm.
I think that's more the biblical view of meditating on the law, like you see in the Psalms. That this has shaped your imagination.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. Yep. It's the mold. We're hardly even aware of the shape of the mold because we are the shape it delivered. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Wow. I've been following immigration news very much.
A little bit. I have a steady diet of theology podcasts and political podcasts, and I choose some that are both on the left of politically and theologically, and on the right politically and theologically,
Mm.
to try and raise questions that I would otherwise miss.
Hmm.
But I don't really do deep dives in most political issues. I do theological issues, but not most political ones. So the immigration thing, yeah, I haven't been following very
Yeah, I've been
closely.
following it closely. Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I saw a statistic the other day. I can't verify it. Clinton deported 12 million persons. Obama deported 5 million persons. These were in 8-year terms.
Sure.
So it immediately for me raised the question of, is this just is this relatively normal operations of the
Sure. Yeah,
government
what's the baseline?
on which there is an abnormal amount of scrutiny,
Right.
right? Like, no, we've been pretty much doing the same thing for the last 8 years, but now we've got television crews following us around, right? Um, yeah. Who's that? I find him almost unbearable. Is it John Oliver? Last week tonight with John Oliver. Yeah. I do. I mean, he has some funny lines, but generally speaking, he's just so loud. And he was going after Trump's immigration claims, not even his policy. This was pre-election. This was pre-election 2.0, right? And one of the claims was this is breaking up families. And so what do? They roll clips of a child. I mean, it really was genuinely heartbreaking of this child crying because her father had been detained and was presumably in custody somewhere. And this poor girl really was having the worst day of her life, no doubt. But like all of it was an attack on Trump's immigration policy. But then if you stopped and thought about it for a minute, they were pulling they said, "Oh, and like this incident happened last year." So it happened in 2023.
Not
It was under right, it was under Biden's ice.
right.
So and it was clever rhetorically. It wasn't perhaps was it dishonest? I don't know if I even want to say that. It might have been a touch
It's
disingenuous.
deliberately meant to be deceptive. So
Right.
I would
Right.
put
Like,
it in
right. This is what Trump is doing. He's not even in office. And you just said this was from last year. So like clearly this stuff is going on now. So yeah, I have a friend who is in ICE. And I'd like to see if we can get him on here and just say, what's the, what's the reality of the boots on the ground? Is this normal? Are there actually operations that are stepped up? Are there operations that are happening, but then others on top of it that wouldn't normally happen, except now this department feels invigorated and sort of mandated by the new administration, which has, golly, it's what, 3 weeks? Isn't that the wildest?
3 years, 3 weeks? I don't know.
Isn't that the wildest thing to think?
It is.
Yeah.
It is remarkable.
January 21st was like 3 weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
A little, almost 4. Yeah.
I think that's probably there's probably a number of reasons for all of the executive orders and actions and all that. But I do think the contrast to Biden's lack of energy was part of the point. I think that was part of the point in the campaigning. I think that's part of the point now. And that's not necessarily to say I agree with anything or disagree with anything that Trump's doing, but it is remarkable to see someone, he's taking questions and right out there and
giving interviews
and he is very much present, maybe a little more present than I would like him to be. I'd like you to be just in the background taking care of stuff and I don't have to think about it. but he is very much active, which was something we've been lacking for a few years now.
Like having a plumber in your basement just banging on the pipes. Like maybe it's helping. For all I know, it is. But
I'm crossing my fingers. I'm not sure what he's doing down there.
But damn, there's a lot of noise going on down there. The last guy was asleep under my old bed down in the spare bedroom in my basement. So, but geez, this new guy. Yeah, no, it does seem like an energetic administration. I'm really curious to see what it produces. I'm sort of keeping an eye on costs of goods. I mean, everyone, the jury is kind of out on what these tariffs will do.
Yeah,
how many of them will be blocked by court order of some kind?
Yeah, I really dislike tariffs. I think that's very foolish. I think free trade is very much the way to go, and I think history has proven that out pretty solidly. So I'm pretty negative on that idea. But so far, if you're using it as a bargaining chip, well, maybe there's a place for that. And there are some non-economic reasons for using tariffs that I can totally get on board with. Slave labor in China and stuff like that. Where I'm like, okay, no, there's a reason here that has nothing to do with the price of goods, that has everything to do with security and ethical standards, and so there's a place for that.
There's a place, right. But again, to what degree is the volume being turned up on a fairly normal bargaining chip? I simply don't know. Yeah. Yep. No, part of me always wants to quit what I'm doing now and just go into journalism and start following this stuff on a more granular level. It's fun to ask questions and pick people's brains. But as Matt Taibbi once said, sometimes you have to make 50 phone calls to get one line of quotable text. So, so podcasts can be easier.
Yeah,
Although
well,
actually, with getting some of our guests booked, sometimes 50 phone calls feels like the minimum. Like, damn, we've been wooing you for a year.
Honestly,
Yeah.
at least 2 of those.
Yeah, we have a couple, but they'll come around. Dr. Aaron Schubert, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. It's
Yeah.
always fun.
What's going on with your current preaching? Is it still being recorded and put on the E-Free website?
Yep. Well, it's available on YouTube if you just look for the Lander Evangelical Free Church, and then it's also similarly you search for that on any podcasting setup, and you'll find the sermons there too.
Perfect. Yeah, it's great stuff. Love going to your sermons and garnering some wisdom. So thanks for coming and sharing.
Thank you.
Acknowledge Kamala couldn't generate her own buzz. Trump could, right? Love him or hate him,
Yeah.
support her or loathe her. She seemed to rely on having Beyonce or Eminem or other stars in her ambit and hoping that their star power would sort of rub off. It seemed to be either her strategy or her campaign management strategy. Whereas Trump seemed to sit on his airplane with his family and come up with the wildest ideas, and people paid attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The McDonald's thing, the
Mc-
trash thing, the Joe Rogan. I mean, just everywhere he went. Blue eyeballs.
Right.
Yeah, and he went on a lot of people were saying that Barron had a lot of influence on which podcast he should go on. So he was on the Nelk Boys, and if you know,
I know nothing about that.
do you know
Barron
Andrew
does.
Schultz?
Yeah.
So he was on the Andrew Schultz podcast, and so a lot of things that a lot of young people are paying attention to, and so they think they got to see a little more of what Trump's personality is like. Like he's not on Fox News or whatever saying something. He's just sitting in a chair. Yeah, honestly, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's cool. I think he understands the language of the people. And this was interesting. I just found this out, and I had suspicion too. But every president that wins uses the lowest grade level of language. So, meaning if you bring your grade level down, more and more people will hear your message. And so if you look at how Trump writes, he doesn't write the way he talks. Like he writes brilliantly. I don't know if you've read some of his books.
Yeah, sorry, I've never read any.
Or like his letters or like statements and things. Very well written. But then the way he talks, it's like
And tweets.
yeah, and tweets. Everyone's like everyone repeats them. Everyone turns it into a joke because how memorable it is.
Mhm.
It might be he might have figured it out a long time ago. He can't talk too high, otherwise he loses people. And you just like keep it simple, straight to the point, make a few jokes.
Wow. We got to work on the titles of our episodes.
Maybe.
Keep it simple, man.
We'll just have like good podcast
Right.
about
Yes.
period.
Yeah. We talk about blank. Yeah. Well, Friends. Do you remember the show Friends? Every episode was named the one about blank,
Yep.
right? And the second most successful sitcom, don't you think? Seinfeld? Seinfeld the most successful?
Oh, probably.
I would think.
Statistically speaking.
Statistically. Well, it's been around longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think Friends would have to be number 2. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's
All the episodes. The one about
That's okay.
Yeah.
Wait, Friends is?
Friends.
the one about hangovers. The
What
one
if
about
New York was nothing but white people who never actually earn money but somehow live in giant apartments? What is this?
It's true. Yeah. You do go back. No, it's true. You go back and like they're all splashing around in the fountain in the intro song, and you look at them and they're all white, and you just think this show could never be made today. It would never get made. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're terrible friends to each other, which just, really caps it off. The
Right.
title of the show is Friends,
Right.
and they're terrible friends. It's like, okay, this is
Yeah.
weird.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it'll be considered the sort of the crown jewel in the
Oh,
in the
sure.
museum of white privilege in the future. Right? Look at these entitled white people who traipsed around New York in fantastic 2,000 plus square foot apartments, never worked,
Really worked.
barely worked.
Worked at a coffee shop. Really?
Right.
How? How? Aspiring, failing actor, and you paid for this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think it struck a chord in the 90s, particularly, but people saw this group of people who belonged and they had a place, right? They
Sure.
could go down to the coffee shop. What was it called? I'm better at
Never watch Friends.
oh, okay. Well, there's someone listening who can correct us on this. Yeah. And I remember watching it and thinking, oh, this connected with an audience that had grown up in isolated suburban McMansions and then were pioneering in the incoming digital age. And so a show that centered around conversations
Sure.
at a coffee shop amongst people who accepted each other, weren't always good to each other, but accepted each other. I think that struck a cultural chord and why it was sort of the unspoken foundation of why people kept tuning in because it represented something they were looking for. Yeah. Yeah. The remarkable effect of suburban dwelling in general, but then also the drops in fuel prices, which enabled us to heat our homes for much cheaper, which enabled us to build bigger and bigger houses, which gave rise to the wave of McMansions in the 90s. I mean, it's a remarkable cultural uh, it's a downstream cultural effect of politics, right? So people often say politics is downstream of culture, but in a way, political action, right, that post Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton really ensured the stability of fuel availability for America. And all of a sudden, we could double or triple the square footage of our homes. Which did that lead to a sense of cultural isolation? It's hard to say. It's hard to say causation, but it's not that hard to say correlation.
Yeah.
So, anyway, are we live?
I turned this on.
Oh, okay.
That could be.